In the unforgiving frontier town of Cinder Creek, where a woman's worth is measured by her virtue and her size, Maddie Holt's story begins not with love, but with abandonment. Pregnant, plus-sized, and cast out like livestock by her own father, she's handed over to a silent giant of a cowboy as punishment for her shame. But what starts as the cruelest transaction will become the most unexpected salvation. This is a story of a woman who was thrown away, and the man who saw treasure where others saw trash. Before we begin, comment below with your city so I can see how far Maddie's story travels across the world. The August sun beat down on Cinder Creek like God's own hammer, turning the Wyoming dust into powder fine enough to choke on. Maddie Holt stood in the barn's shade, her swollen hands gripping a water bucket, her 7-month belly pressing against the worn fabric of her only dress that still fit. The fabric stretched tight across her middle, and she could feel the baby moving, restless, insistent, as if it already knew what kind of world it was entering. "Maddie!" Her father's voice cracked across the yard like a whip. She flinched, sloshing water over the bucket's edge. Abel Holt appeared in the barn door, his silhouette cutting sharp against the blazing light behind him. Even in shadow, she could see the disgust carved into every line of his weathered face. "Get yourself cleaned up," he said, his voice flat and cold as January steel. "We're riding out in an hour." Maddie's heart stuttered. "Riding out? Pa, I can't. The baby—" "Don't you dare speak of that bastard child under my roof." Abel stepped closer and Maddie instinctively backed against the barn wall, the rough wood catching on her dress. "You've brought enough shame to this family. Today, we remedy that." The water bucket slipped from Maddie's fingers, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Water spread across the parched ground, disappearing almost instantly. "What do you mean?" But Abel had already turned away, his boots kicking up dust as he strode toward the house. "1 hour, Madeline. Don't make me come fetch you." Maddie stood frozen, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. The baby kicked against her palm, a small reassurance that she wasn't completely alone. But as she watched her father disappear into the house, she felt that loneliness settle over her like a shroud. She'd been 15 weeks along when her father first noticed. The morning sickness had been easy enough to hide, but the changing shape of her body, that betrayed her. She'd never forget the look in Abel's eyes when he'd cornered her in the kitchen, his hand gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "Whose is it?" he'd demanded. Maddie had tried to speak, tried to explain about Thomas Fletcher, the banker's son who'd whispered promises under the cottonwood tree behind the church, promises of love, of marriage, of a future that shimmered like a mirage. But when she'd told Thomas about the baby, he'd looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "You're lying," Thomas had said, his handsome face twisting with contempt. "Besides, look at you. Who'd believe I'd touch someone like you?" The words had cut deeper than any knife. Maddie had always been big, not just pregnant big, but the kind of big that made the town women whisper and the men look away. The kind of big that meant she'd never been asked to dance at the harvest social, never been courted properly, never been made to feel like anything other than an inconvenience taking up too much space. Thomas had left Cinder Creek 2 weeks later. Last she'd heard, he was in Denver, courting a railroad baron's daughter. And Maddie was here, swelling larger with each passing day, while her father's rage grew to match. The past 2 months had been a special kind of hell. Abel had stopped speaking to her except to give orders. Her stepmother, Martha, had died 3 years prior, and there were no other women in the house to soften Abel's sharp edges. The ranch hands avoided her eyes when she passed. The few times Abel had taken her into town, the whispers followed her like a second shadow. Poor Abel Holt, stuck with that girl. Shameful is what it is, and her the size of 2 women already. Wonder who the father is. Must have been desperate or blind. Now, standing in the barn with her father's words echoing in her ears, Maddie felt the weight of all those whispered judgments settling into her bones. She wanted to run, but where would she go? She had no money, no friends who would risk Abel's wrath to help her. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Maddie felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her unborn child. "I'm so sorry." An hour later, Maddie sat in the wagon beside her father, her small bundle of belongings at her feet. Abel hadn't explained where they were going. and Maddie had learned long ago not to ask questions that would only earn her silence or worse. They rode northeast, away from town, into the wild country where homesteads grew sparse and the land stretched empty and unforgiving. The wagon wheels creaked over the rough trail, and with each mile, Maddie's dread grew heavier. After 2 hours, Abel pulled the wagon to a stop at a fence line that seemed to mark nothing but emptiness. Beyond the fence, the prairie rolled on toward distant hills, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted tree. "Get down," Abel said. Maddie's hands shook as she climbed down from the wagon, her pregnant belly making every movement awkward and difficult. The August heat pressed down on her, and she could feel sweat trickling down her back, making her dress cling uncomfortably to her skin. She turned to ask her father what they were doing here, but the words died in her throat. A man sat on horseback about 50 yards away, perfectly still, watching them. He was massive. Even seated on his horse, Maddie could tell he was built like a mountain. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun, his arms thick with muscle even through his shirt. A dark hat shadowed his face, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. "Pa?" Maddie's voice came out small and frightened. Abel didn't look at her. Instead, he raised his hand in a brief wave, and the man on horseback began to move toward them. His horse walked with steady, unhurried steps, closing the distance with an inevitability that made Maddie's heart pound. As the rider drew closer, Maddie could make out more details. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 35, with a weathered face that spoke of years in the sun and wind, dark hair touched with gray at the temples, a jaw carved from granite, and eyes. Even from a distance, she could see they were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. He was, in a word, terrifying. The man brought his horse to a stop at the fence line. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the endless whisper of wind through the prairie grass. "Calder?" Abel said, his voice gruff. "Holt," the big man replied. His voice was deep, rumbling up from somewhere in his chest, quiet, but somehow carrying across the space between them. Abel turned to Maddie then, and the look in his eyes made her stomach clench. "Madeline, this is Rhett Calder. He's agreed to take you off my hands." The words hit Maddie like a physical blow. "What?" "You heard me." Abel's face was hard as stone. "I won't have you birthing a bastard under my roof, disgracing the Holt name any more than you already have. Calder here needs a woman to keep his house. You'll go with him. Do your work. Earn your keep." Maddie felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "You're selling me? Like livestock?" "I'm solving a problem," Abel snapped. "You should be grateful. Most men wouldn't take on a woman in your condition, especially one who's—" He gestured vaguely at her body, his lip curling with distaste. "Calder's doing you a kindness." Maddie looked at the silent man on the horse. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, just sat there watching her with those storm cloud eyes. She couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if he was pleased or disgusted or simply indifferent to the transaction taking place. "I won't go," Maddie said, her voice shaking but determined. "You can't make me." Abel's hand shot out, gripping her arm with bruising force. "You'll go, or you'll find yourself on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Is that what you want? To birth that child in a ditch somewhere?" Tears burned in Maddie's eyes. "How can you do this? I'm your daughter." "You stopped being my daughter the moment you spread your legs for some man and came home carrying his shame." Abel's voice was cold, final. "Now get your things and get on that horse." Maddie's vision blurred with tears. She looked at Rhett Calder again, this giant of a man who was supposed to be her salvation, but looked more like her doom. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But where? She had nothing, no one. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs, and Maddie made her decision. Better to go with this stranger than to risk her child's life on the street. "Fine," she whispered. Abel released her arm and grabbed her bundle from the wagon, shoving it at her. Good riddance. Those were the last words her father spoke to her. He climbed back into the wagon and turned the horses around without a backward glance. Maddie stood there, clutching her meager belongings, watching the wagon grow smaller as it rolled back toward Cinder Creek. She was alone with a stranger who'd bought her like a horse at auction. Slowly, Maddie turned to face Rhett Calder. Up close, he was even more imposing. The man was easily 6.5 feet tall, built like a barn, with hands that looked like they could snap a fence post in half. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently stern expression. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They weren't cruel. That's what surprised her. They were steady, measuring, but not unkind. "Can you ride?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle, despite its depth. Maddie shook her head, fresh humiliation washing over her. "Not in my condition." Rhett nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. Without a word, he dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He was even bigger standing up, towering over her by more than a foot. Maddie instinctively took a step back. Rhett paused, his eyes flickering with something that might have been understanding. "Won't hurt you," he said simply. Then he turned to his horse, a massive bay gelding, and began adjusting the saddle. "What are you doing?" Maddie asked. "Making room for two." He worked efficiently, loosening straps and repositioning things in a way that made no sense to Maddie, but clearly had purpose to him. When he was satisfied, he turned back to her. "I'll lift you up. Don't fight it. You'll just make it harder on yourself and the baby." Before Maddie could protest, Rhett's hands closed around her waist. They were huge, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, settling her sideways on the saddle with a care that shocked her. No one had touched her gently in months. Rhett mounted behind her, his arm coming around her waist to hold the reins. His chest was solid against her back, and Maddie found herself surrounded by him, his size, his warmth, his presence. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he instructed. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch." And just like that, they were moving. The horse walked with a steady gait, and Rhett's arm kept Maddie secure, his body shifting with the horse's movements in a way that kept her balanced. For the first 15 minutes, Maddie was too overwhelmed to speak. Her mind churned with everything that had just happened. Her father had thrown her away. The stranger had taken her like property. She was heading to an unknown place with an unknown future. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. Rhett was silent for so long that Maddie thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Why what? Why did you agree to this? To take me?" Another long silence. The horse's hooves clopped rhythmically against the hard-packed earth. Finally, Rhett spoke, his voice rumbling through his chest and into Maddie's back. "Needed help with the ranch? House gets lonely. Figure you need a roof over your head, and I can provide that." He paused. "Seemed like a fair trade." "My father said you needed a woman to keep house," Maddie said bitterly. "He meant a servant." "No," Rhett said, and there was a firmness to his voice that made Maddie turn her head to look at him. "I meant what I said. Ranch needs work, and I can't be two places at once. You'll earn your keep, same as anyone. But you're not a servant, you're—" He seemed to search for the right word. "A partner, of sorts." "I'm pregnant with another man's child," Maddie said bluntly, testing him. "I'm fat. The whole town thinks I'm a whore. Are you sure that's the kind of partner you want?" Rhett's arm tightened slightly around her waist. Not painfully, but protectively. "Don't care what the town thinks, and you're carrying a child, not some moral failing. As for the rest," he shrugged, the motion moving Maddie slightly. "I see a woman who got dealt a bad hand and is doing her best. That's enough for me." Maddie felt something crack inside her chest, some hard, painful thing that had been building for months. She turned her face away so Rhett wouldn't see the tears streaming down her cheeks. They rode in silence after that, moving deeper into wild country. Maddie watched the landscape change, the scrubland giving way to rolling hills, a creek cutting through a valley, and finally, in the distance, she spotted a cluster of buildings. Rhett's ranch wasn't much to look at, but it was more than Maddie had expected. A sturdy log cabin stood at the center, smoke curling from its stone chimney despite the summer heat. A barn, weathered but well-maintained, sat to the left. A chicken coop, a small corral with 2 horses, and what looked like a workshop completed the homestead. It was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but prairie and sky. To some, it might have seemed lonely. To Maddie, in that moment, it looked like sanctuary. Rhett brought the horse to a stop in front of the cabin. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Maddie down. His hands were gentle again, lowering her carefully until her feet touched solid ground. Maddie's legs trembled from the long ride, and she stumbled. Rhett's hand shot out, steadying her. "Easy," he said. "You've had a long day." That was an understatement. Maddie looked up at this giant of a man who'd bought her from her father like livestock, and she didn't know what to feel. Fear? Gratitude? Despair? All of it mixed together in a confusing tangle. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Rhett picked up her bundle from where he tied it to the saddle. "Now you get settled. I'll show you the house. You can pick a room. Then you should rest. You look worn out." "A room?" Maddie repeated. "My own room?" Rhett's expression didn't change. "Unless you want to sleep in the barn." "No, I thought—" Maddie stopped, not sure how to articulate what she'd feared. That he'd expect her to share his bed. That he'd claim some kind of husband's rights. Never mind that they weren't married. Understanding flickered in Rhett's gray-blue eyes. "You'll have your own space, Maddie. That's not negotiable." The use of her name, said in his quiet, rumbling voice, made something in Maddie's chest tighten. When was the last time someone had said her name without contempt attached to it? Rhett led her into the cabin, and Maddie found herself in a space that was simple but clean. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. 2 doors led off the main room, bedrooms, presumably. "That one's mine," Rhett said, pointing to the door on the left. "You can have the other. It's smaller, but there's a bed and a chest for your things." Maddie peeked into the room. It was indeed small, but compared to what she'd feared, a corner in a barn, a pile of blankets on the floor, it was a palace. The bed had a real mattress, and someone, Rhett, she presumed, had already put fresh linens on it. "Thank you," she whispered. Rhett nodded. "Privy's out back. Well's by the side of the house. I'll show you around properly tomorrow, but for now, you should rest. I'll make some supper in a bit." "You cook?" The question escaped before Maddie could stop it. A ghost of a smile flickered across Rhett's weathered face. "Been taking care of myself for near about 10 years. Had to learn." He set her bundle on the bed. "Get some rest, Maddie." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Maddie was alone for the first time since morning. She sank onto the bed, her legs finally giving out, and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. Her father had thrown her away, had looked at her, his own daughter, and seen nothing worth keeping. The pain of that rejection was a physical thing, sitting in her chest like a stone. But this man, this stranger, had taken her in without judgment, had promised her a room of her own, had spoken to her with more kindness in an hour than her father had shown in months. Maddie didn't know what to make of Rhett Calder. He was a puzzle, a huge, silent, unexpectedly gentle puzzle. The baby kicked, and Maddie placed both hands on her belly. "I don't know what we've gotten into," she murmured. "But maybe it's not the worst thing." Through the thin walls, she could hear Rhett moving around the kitchen, the clank of pots and the crackle of the fire being stoked. Normal sounds, homely sounds. For the first time in months, Maddie felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough. That evening, Rhett brought her a plate of beans and cornbread. The food was simple but well cooked, and Maddie ate every bite, suddenly ravenous. She hadn't realized how hungry she'd been. Her father had been feeding her, but barely, as if grudging every mouthful. Rhett sat at the table while she ate, sipping coffee and watching her with those steady eyes. "Questions?" he asked when she'd finished. Maddie had about 1,000, but she settled on the most pressing. "What do you expect from me?" "You said I'd earn my keep." "Cooking, cleaning, mending, basic housework. Nothing heavy, nothing that'll risk the baby. When you're up to it, help with the chickens, maybe the garden. We'll figure it out as we go." He paused. "You're not my prisoner, Maddie. You're free to leave if you want, but if you stay, you work. That's the deal." "And after the baby comes?" "Same deal. You help with the ranch, I provide a roof and food. The child is yours. I won't try to claim it or send it away. You raise it how you see fit." It was more than fair. It was generous, even. "Why are you doing this?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his large hands. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost distant. My wife died 7 years ago. We were expecting our first child. She went into labor early, and he stopped, swallowing hard. Neither of them made it. The midwife said if I'd gotten help sooner, maybe things would have been different. But we were out here alone, miles from town, and by the time I got back with the doctor, he shook his head. I've been alone since then. The ranch is good, but it's not enough to fill the days. When your father made his offer, I saw a chance to help someone who needed it. Figured it might help me too. Maddie felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry about your wife and baby. It was a long time ago. Rhett drained his coffee and stood. You should get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how this arrangement works. After he left, Maddie changed into her nightgown, the only one she owned that still fit over her belly, and climbed into bed. The mattress was more comfortable than her bed at her father's house had been. The sheets smelled like lye soap and sunshine. Through the wall, she could hear Rhett moving around in his room, the creak of floorboards as he settled in for the night. Maddie stared at the ceiling, her hands resting on her belly, where the baby seemed to have finally quieted. So much had changed in one day. This morning she'd been in her father's house, living under his contempt. Tonight she was in a stranger's home, under his protection. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if Rhett Calder would prove to be the decent man he seemed, or if this was all some elaborate trap. But as exhaustion finally pulled her under, Maddie found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, being thrown away was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Maddie woke to the sound of roosters crowing and morning light streaming through her window. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing the room. Then yesterday came flooding back, and she sat up carefully, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the door, and Maddie's stomach growled in response. She dressed as quickly as her condition allowed and ventured out into the main room. Rhett stood at the stove, his broad back to her, cooking breakfast with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He must have heard her. It was hard to move quietly when you were carrying an extra 30 pounds. But he didn't turn around. Morning, he said. Coffee's on the table. Food'll be ready in a minute. Good morning. Maddie poured herself a cup of coffee, adding a generous spoonful of sugar. The first sip was heaven. Rhett brought 2 plates to the table, each loaded with bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes. He sat across from her and began to eat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Sleep all right? He asked. Better than I have in months, Maddie admitted. The bed's comfortable. Good. Rhett nodded at her plate. Eat up. After breakfast, I'll show you around proper, give you an idea of the daily work. They ate in companionable silence, and Maddie found herself stealing glances at her unlikely benefactor. In the morning light, Rhett looked tired. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of hard work and harder years. But there was also something solid about him, something dependable. After breakfast, Rhett led her outside. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching day. He showed her the chicken coop first, a dozen hens and 1 proud rooster who eyed Maddie suspiciously. Eggs are collected every morning, Rhett explained. They're mostly yours to manage, feeding, collecting, keeping the coop clean. Think you can handle that? Maddie nodded. I helped with chickens at my father's place. Good. They moved on to the garden, a patch of earth near the house where tomatoes, beans, and squash grew in neat rows. Water this every evening when it's hot like this. Pick whatever's ripe. We eat what we grow, can what we don't eat. The tour continued, the barn where 2 additional horses and a milk cow lived, the workshop where Rhett did his carpentry and repairs, the smokehouse, the root cellar. It was a well-maintained operation, clearly the work of someone who took pride in their homestead. Questions? Rhett asked when they'd made the circuit. It's just you here? No ranch hands? Just me. I hire help during roundup and branding season, but day to day it's a one-man operation. Well, he glanced at her, 2 people now. Maddie felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Rhett was giving her shelter, food, safety. The least she could do was pull her weight. When do we start? A hint of approval flickered in Rhett's eyes. Right now's fine. Why don't you tackle the chickens while I see to the horses? Take your time, and if you need help, just holler. They separated to their tasks, and Maddie found herself alone with the chickens. The rooster, whom she mentally dubbed Napoleon for his imperious attitude, watched her every move as she scattered feed and checked the nesting boxes. The work was simple, familiar, and oddly soothing. For these few minutes, Maddie wasn't a pregnant woman cast out by her father. She wasn't a scandal or a shame. She was just someone doing a necessary job, and there was a quiet dignity in that. She collected 8 eggs, cradling them carefully in her apron as she made her way back to the house. Through the barn door, she could see Rhett brushing down one of the horses, his movement steady and sure. The days began to take on a rhythm. Maddie woke early, helped with breakfast, tended the chickens and garden. Rhett handled the heavier work, the horses, the cattle he ran on the open range, the endless repairs that a ranch demanded. They ate meals together, worked in companionable silence, and gradually, Maddie began to relax. Rhett was true to his word about everything. He didn't touch her inappropriately, didn't make demands beyond the work she could reasonably do. He treated her with a steady respect that Maddie had never experienced before. But it was the small things that undid her. The way Rhett always served her first at meals, making sure she had enough before he took his portion. The way he'd carved a small step stool so she could reach the higher shelves without straining. The way he brought in wildflowers and left them in a jar on the kitchen table without comment. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maddie found a wooden footstool beside her bed. Her ankles had been swelling in the heat, and she'd been propping them on her bundle of clothes. Rhett must have noticed and made the stool in his workshop. Maddie sat on her bed holding the stool and cried for 20 minutes straight. 2 weeks after Maddie arrived at the ranch, they had their first visitor. Maddie was in the garden, pulling weeds between the tomato plants, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She straightened, difficult with her belly, and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. A man on horseback was approaching from the direction of town. Even from a distance, Maddie could see his fancy clothes and the smirk on his face, her stomach clenched with dread. The man rode right up to the garden fence, deliberately letting his horse trample some of the squash plants Maddie had been tending. He was young, maybe 25, with slicked back hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never done real work. "Well, well," he said, his eyes raking over Maddie's pregnant form with undisguised contempt. "If it isn't the Holt girl. Heard old Abel finally got rid of you. Guess even a father's love has its limits when his daughter turns into a fat whore." Maddie felt the words like physical blows, but she lifted her chin. "You need to leave." "Oh, I'll leave when I'm ready." The man, Maddie thought his name might be Crawford, one of the ranch owners from south of town, leaned forward in his saddle. "Just wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true. That Rhett Calder took in Abel Holt's disgraced daughter and her bastard. Must be desperate for company, or maybe he just wanted a cow that could cook." "I said leave." Maddie's voice shook, but she stood her ground. Crawford laughed. "What are you going to do about it, sweetheart? Waddle at me threateningly?" "No," came a deep, quiet voice from behind Maddie. "But I might." Maddie turned to see Rhett walking toward them from the barn. He moved with a deceptive laziness, but there was something in his posture that made Crawford's smirk falter. "Calder," Crawford said, trying to regain his bravado. "I was just insulting my guest," Rhett finished. He'd reached the fence now, and Maddie noticed he'd brought a fence post with him, a thick piece of timber that must have weighed 40 pounds. He held it like it was a walking stick. "That's not neighborly, Crawford." "Guest," Crawford sneered. "That's a generous word for what she is." Rhett didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the fence where Crawford's horse had trampled the squash. With one smooth motion, he drove the fence post into the ground with his bare hands, the wood sinking a foot deep into the packed earth. The casual display of raw strength made Crawford's eyes widen. "You should go now," Rhett said quietly. "And if you come back here, if you so much as look at Maddie wrong when you see her in town, I'll take that fence post and show you what else I can do with it." There was no bluster in Rhett's voice, no shouting, just a calm promise that was somehow more terrifying than any threat. Crawford swallowed hard. "You're making a mistake, Calder. Tying yourself to trash like—" Rhett took one step toward the fence. Crawford jerked his horse's reins and rode off, kicking up dust in his wake. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Rhett turned to Maddie. "You all right?" Maddie nodded, not trusting her voice. The fear and humiliation of Crawford's words still churned in her stomach, but overlaying it was something else: awe at how Rhett had defended her without hesitation. "He's not wrong, though," Maddie said quietly. "I am trash. I'm used goods, pregnant with a bastard. You shouldn't have to defend me from the truth." Rhett's jaw tightened. He walked around the fence and stood in front of Maddie, so tall she had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice still quiet but intense. "You're not trash. You're not used goods. You're a woman who trusted the wrong man and paid for it. That's not the same as being worthless." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "The only trash I see is men like Crawford who think they can measure a person's worth by their mistakes or their body." Tears stung Maddie's eyes. "Why do you care? You barely know me." "Don't need to know someone long to see their character," Rhett said. "I've watched you these past 2 weeks. You work hard, you don't complain, you treat the animals gentle and the house with respect. That tells me what I need to know." One of Maddie's tears spilled over, tracking down her dusty cheek. Rhett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and wiped it away with his thumb. His hand was rough with calluses, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "You're safe here, Maddie," he said. "As long as you want to stay, this is your home. Nobody gets to make you feel small. Not Crawford, not your father, not anyone." Maddie couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she just nodded. Rhett gave her shoulder a brief squeeze, then turned back toward the barn. "I'll fix the fence," he called over his shoulder. "You should get out of the sun. It's too hot for you and the baby." Maddie watched him go, this mountain of a man who'd shown her more kindness in 2 weeks than most people had in her entire life. And for the first time since she'd learned about the baby, Maddie felt something other than shame and fear. She felt protected. That night, as Maddie lay in bed with her hands on her restless baby, she thought about Crawford's words, about how they'd hurt, yes, but how Rhett's defense had somehow made them lose their power. Maybe she was trash in the eyes of Cinder Creek. Maybe she always would be. But in this house, under this roof, she was beginning to believe she might be something more. The wildflowers came the next morning. Maddie found them in a tin cup on the kitchen table when she emerged from her room, a handful of prairie blossoms in shades of yellow and purple, their stems still wet with dew. Rhett was already outside tending to the horses, his broad silhouette visible through the window as he worked in the early light. She touched the delicate petals with trembling fingers, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. No one had ever given her flowers before. Not Thomas with his empty promises. Not the boys who'd looked past her at church socials. Not even her father on the birthdays he'd bothered to acknowledge. When Rhett came in for breakfast, Maddie had biscuits and gravy waiting, along with scrambled eggs and the last of the bacon. He paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and looked at the spread with something like surprise. "Didn't have to do all this," he said. "I wanted to." Maddie wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly shy. "Thank you for the flowers." Rhett's weather-worn face colored slightly. "Saw them on my morning ride. Thought they'd brighten the place up." They sat down to eat, and Maddie found herself watching him across the table. The way he ate with quiet efficiency, the way his large hands handled the delicate china cup with unexpected care. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind?" "I was just thinking," Maddie said slowly, "that you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone meaner, I suppose. Someone who'd lord his generosity over me, remind me daily that I should be grateful." She paused, gathering courage. "Someone who'd expect more than housework in exchange for a roof." Rhett set down his fork, his gray-blue eyes steady on hers. "I'm not your father, Maddie, and I'm not whatever man left you in this condition. You're here because we made an agreement. Honest work for honest shelter. That's all there is to it." "But why?" The question burst out of her. "Why would you take on someone else's burden? Someone like me?" "Already told you. The ranch needs help, and you need a place. It's practical." He picked up his fork again, but there was something in his expression that suggested there was more he wasn't saying. "Besides, maybe I'm tired of eating my own cooking." It was such an unexpected bit of humor that Maddie actually laughed, surprising them both. The sound seemed to fill the small cabin, chasing away shadows Maddie hadn't realized were there. Rhett's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "There now. That's better than crying." "I do seem to cry a lot lately," Maddie admitted. The baby makes everything feel bigger somehow. My Anna was the same way when she was expecting. Rhett's voice went soft, distant, could go from laughing to sobbing in the space of a heartbeat. Used to drive her mad, but I thought it was... He stopped, shaking his head. Sorry. You don't need to hear about that. I don't mind, Maddie said quietly. If you want to talk about her. Rhett was silent for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. Anna was small, delicate, everything I'm not. Met her in town. She was a seamstress, had the prettiest smile you ever saw. Took me 3 months to work up the courage to speak to her, and another 6 to convince her to marry me. She said yes on a Tuesday. We were married that Sunday, and I brought her here. He paused, staring into his coffee as if seeing the past reflected there. She loved this place. Made curtains for the windows, planted that garden you're tending now, filled the house with singing. When she told me about the baby, I thought my heart would burst. His jaw tightened. Labor came early. She was so small, and the baby was... There were complications. I rode for the doctor, but the nearest one was in Cinder Creek, and by the time we got back... You don't have to finish, Maddie said, her throat tight. She asked me to save the baby, Rhett continued, as if he hadn't heard her. With her last breath, she begged me to save our child. But there was nothing to save. The doctor said they'd both been gone for hours. He finally looked up, and the raw grief in his eyes made Maddie's chest ache. I buried them together under the cottonwood out back. Put Anna's favorite flowers on the grave every Sunday for a year, until I couldn't stand to do it anymore. Maddie reached across the table, covering his large hand with her smaller one. I'm so sorry, Rhett. He looked down at their joined hands, then carefully, gently, turned his palm up and squeezed her fingers. It was a long time ago. But it's why I said yes when your father came around. Figured if I could help keep a woman and baby safe, maybe it would balance the scales somehow. That's not how it works, Maddie said softly. Anna's death wasn't your fault. Head knows that. Heart slower to learn. Rhett released her hand and stood, carrying his plate to the basin. Anyway, that's ancient history. We've got today to worry about. But as Maddie watched him walk outside, she understood him a little better. Rhett Calder wasn't just offering her shelter out of practical need. He was trying to save someone he couldn't save 7 years ago. The thought should have made her uneasy, but instead, it made her want to prove she was worth saving. The days turned into weeks, and Maddie settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. Her belly grew rounder, the baby more active, but Rhett was always there to help with the tasks that became too difficult. He'd take over the heavier chores without being asked, seeming to sense when she was struggling before she had to admit it. He also talked more as time went on, his quiet nature gradually revealing depths Maddie hadn't expected. In the evenings, after the work was done and they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rhett would tell her about the land, where the best fishing was, which plants the horses avoided because they were poisonous, how to read the weather in the clouds. See those mare's tails? He said one evening, pointing to wispy clouds streaking across the orange sky. Rain's coming in 2, maybe 3 days. How can you tell? Maddie asked, genuinely curious. Been watching this sky for 10 years. You learn the signs. He glanced at her, then away. Your father teach you anything about ranching? My father taught me that a woman's place was in the kitchen and the church pew, Maddie said bitterly. Everything else was for men to handle. That's foolish thinking. Woman who knows the land is worth 10 men who don't. Rhett stretched his long legs out in front of him. I'll teach you what I can. Never know when you might need it. And he did teach her. How to calm a skittish horse with a soft voice and steady hands. How to tell if the chickens were getting enough protein by the color of their egg yolks. How to preserve vegetables for winter. How to read tracks in the dust. How to fix a broken fence rail. Maddie absorbed it all, like parched ground soaking up rain. For the first time in her life, she felt useful in a way that went beyond cleaning and cooking. She had skills, knowledge, value. But it wasn't just the work that changed her. It was Rhett's steady presence, his quiet respect, the way he never made her feel like she was taking up too much space or asking too much of him. One afternoon, while Maddie was hanging laundry, she caught sight of herself in the window's reflection. Her dress, one of two that still fit, pulled tight across her swollen belly. Her face was fuller than it had been, her arms soft and thick. By all of Cinder Creek's standards, she was grotesque. But as she stood there, hands on her belly feeling the baby kick, Maddie realized something had shifted. She still saw the extra weight, still felt the old shame trying to resurface. But underneath it was something new, a small, fragile sense that maybe her worth wasn't tied to her size after all. "You look thoughtful," Rhett said, appearing beside her with an armload of firewood. Maddie jumped. "You move too quietly for a man your size." "Learned to walk soft when I was hunting." He set the wood down near the stove. "Something troubling you?" "Just thinking," Maddie said. She hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I've spent my whole life being told I'm too big, too much, taking up too much space. My father used to say I ate enough for 2 men. Thomas said—" She stopped, the memory still painful. "He said a lot of things about my body. None of them kind." Rhett's expression darkened. "Thomas is the father?" "Yes. Thomas Fletcher, the banker's son." Maddie laughed without humor. "I was so foolish. He said he loved me, said we'd get married. I believed him because I wanted so desperately to believe someone could want me. When I told him about the baby, he looked at me like I was something he'd stepped in." "Where is he now?" There was something dangerous in Rhett's quiet voice. "Denver, last I heard, courting a railroad man's daughter." Maddie wrapped her arms around herself. "It doesn't matter. He's gone, and I'm here, and I'm starting to think maybe that's exactly how it should be." Rhett was quiet for a moment, then he moved closer. He was so tall that even standing, Maddie had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Of course. When your father brought you to that fence line, I expected, well, I don't know what I expected, but not you." He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "You got down from that wagon with your head high, even though you were terrified. You didn't beg or cry or make a scene. You just accepted what was happening with a kind of dignity I hadn't seen in a long time." "I was too shocked to do anything else," Maddie admitted. "Maybe. But in the weeks since, you've worked harder than any man I've hired. You've never complained, never asked for anything beyond what we agreed. And you treat this place, my home, with respect and care." He paused. "What I'm trying to say is, anyone who looked at you and saw anything less than a strong, capable woman is a damned fool." Maddie's eyes burned with sudden tears. "You don't have to say that just to make me feel better." "I don't say things I don't mean." Rhett's voice was firm. "You think your size makes you less? All I see is a woman strong enough to carry a child, strong enough to survive her father's cruelty, strong enough to start over with nothing but courage. That's not weakness, Maddie. That's the strongest thing I know." A sob caught in Maddie's throat. Before she could think better of it, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Rhett's waist, pressing her face against his chest. For a moment he stood frozen, clearly surprised. Then his arms came around her, careful not to press against her belly, and held her while she cried. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt. "Thank you for seeing me." Rhett's hand moved in slow circles on her back. "Hard not to see you, Maddie. You fill up the whole house." She pulled back, stricken. "I'm sorry. I know I take up too much." "No." Rhett's hands moved to her shoulders, his gray-blue eyes intense. "I meant your presence, your laughter, your singing when you think I can't hear, the way you rearrange things to make them nicer. You've brought life back to this place. That's what I meant." Maddie searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or pity. But all she saw was sincerity, and something else, something warm and complicated that made her breath catch. "Rhett," she said softly, "what are we doing here?" "What do you mean?" "This." She gestured between them. "It started as a business arrangement, but it feels like more. Sometimes when you look at me, I think—" She stopped, afraid to finish the thought. "You think what?" Rhett's voice had gone rough. "I think maybe I'm not the only one who's starting to care." Rhett's hands tightened briefly on her shoulders, then released her. He took a step back, putting distance between them, and Maddie felt the loss like a physical thing. "The baby's due in about 6 weeks," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We should focus on getting ready for that. Make sure you have what you need, that the house is prepared. It was a deflection, and they both knew it. But Maddie let it pass, nodding slowly. You're right, the baby comes first. But as Rhett walked outside, ostensibly to check on the horses, Maddie knew something had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, and she didn't know whether to be terrified or exhilarated. That night, unable to sleep, Maddie sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the moon paint silver shadows across the floor. She heard Rhett's door open and wasn't surprised when he appeared, looking as restless as she felt. Can't sleep either? He asked. The baby's dancing, Maddie said, placing a hand on her belly where vigorous kicks were making themselves known. Feels like there's a whole rodeo happening in there. Can I? Rhett gestured toward her belly. Maddie nodded, her heart beating faster. Rhett crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. Slowly, giving her time to refuse, he placed his large hand on her belly. The baby kicked, hard enough that they both felt it clearly. Strong, Rhett murmured, wonder in his voice. His hand spread wide, covering most of Maddie's belly. That's a fighter you've got there. Takes after its mother, I suppose, Maddie said with a weak smile. Stubborn and difficult. Takes after its mother, Rhett agreed, looking up at her. Strong and brave and beautiful. The word hung between them. Beautiful. Maddie had never been called beautiful in her life, not even by Thomas in his most persuasive moments. Rhett, I meant what I said this afternoon, he interrupted, his hand still resting on her belly where the baby continued its acrobatics. You've brought life back to this house, to me. I didn't realize how much I'd shut myself away until you came along and opened all the windows. I'm pregnant with another man's child, Maddie said, needing him to understand the full weight of what he was implying. I'll always be the woman who got pregnant outside marriage, who was so desperate for love that she gave herself to someone who didn't deserve her. The town will never forget that. Let them remember, Rhett said fiercely. Let them whisper and judge. I don't care what Cinder Creek thinks, and neither should you. But you'll be tied to that scandal. People will talk about you too. People have always talked about me. The hermit in the hills, the man who buried his wife and never looked at another woman, the fool who thought he could tame this land alone. He shifted closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face. Let them talk, Maddie. I've been alone for 7 years and I was fine with that. Accepted it. Then you showed up and suddenly I'm not fine with it anymore. What are you saying? Maddie's voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying I want you to stay, not as help, not as some business arrangement, as... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. As my wife, if you'll have me. Give the baby my name. Make this a real home. I know it's not romantic. I know I'm not offering love or poetry, but I can offer protection, stability, and a chance for you and the baby to build a real life. Maddie's heart hammered against her ribs. You'd marry me? Take on my child as yours? In a heartbeat. Rhett's thumb traced her cheekbone. I know it's fast. I know it's not what you dreamed of. But if you can see your way to trusting me, I swear I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. What about love? Maddie asked, the question torn from somewhere deep inside her. Rhett's expression softened. Maybe love grows. Maybe it starts as respect and care and builds into something bigger. Or maybe... He stopped, took a breath. Maybe I've been half in love with you since you stood up to Crawford and showed him you weren't afraid. Maybe it's been growing every time you sing to yourself in the garden, every time you leave coffee warming for me on the stove, every time you smile like you just did something clever. Tears spilled down Maddie's cheeks. I'm scared. So am I. Rhett's admission was raw, honest. Terrified, if I'm being truthful, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone. The baby kicked again, as if offering its own opinion on the matter. Maddie laughed through her tears and covered Rhett's hand with hers, pressing both their palms against her belly. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Rhett's face transformed, the hard lines softening, his eyes brightening with something that looked remarkably like joy. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. Thank you, he murmured. I'll take care of you, Maddie. Both of you. I promise." They sat there in the moonlight, connected by their joined hands on her belly, and Maddie felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of coming home. She'd been thrown away like garbage, traded like livestock, cast out as shame incarnate. But in this quiet cabin with this gentle giant of a man, she was beginning to understand that sometimes the worst thing that could happen was actually the door opening to the best thing you never knew to ask for. The next morning, Rhett rode into town while Maddie stayed home, ostensibly to rest, but really because she wasn't ready to face the whispers yet. He returned in the early afternoon with the preacher in tow, a kindly old man named Reverend Morrison, who'd apparently known Rhett for years. "Rhett tells me you need marrying," Reverend Morrison said, his eyes twinkling as he looked between them. "That true, young lady?" "Yes, sir," Maddie said, suddenly nervous. "And you're willing, not being forced?" "I'm willing. More than willing." Maddie looked at Rhett, who stood tall and solid beside her, and felt certainty bloom in her chest. "Very willing." "Well then," Reverend Morrison opened his Bible. "Let's make this official." The ceremony was simple, almost stark in its brevity. They stood in the main room of the cabin, with only the preacher as witness. Rhett held Maddie's hands in his much larger ones, his thumb stroking over her knuckles as Reverend Morrison spoke the ancient words. "Do you," Rhett called her, "take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Rhett's voice was steady, sure. "And do you, Madeline Holt, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Maddie looked up at Rhett, at this man who'd shown her kindness when she expected cruelty, who'd defended her without hesitation, who'd offered her and her unborn child a future when her own father had thrown her away. "I do," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Morrison smiled. "You may kiss your bride, Rhett." Rhett hesitated, his eyes searching Maddie's face as if asking permission. She nodded slightly, and he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. It was chaste, brief, but Maddie felt it all the way down to her toes. When they pulled apart, she was Maddie Calder. No longer Holt, no longer alone. Reverend Morrison stayed for supper, regaling them with stories of Rhett as a younger man. "Stubborn as a mule even then," he said with affection, "but honest as the day is long. You've got yourself a good man, Mrs. Calder." Mrs. Calder. The name felt strange and wonderful on Maddie's tongue. After the preacher left, promising to file the marriage certificate in town the next day, Maddie and Rhett stood on the porch, watching the sunset in streaks of orange and gold. "We should talk about sleeping arrangements," Rhett said quietly. "I don't expect, that is, you can keep your room. This doesn't have to change anything you're not ready to change." Maddie considered this, one hand resting on her belly where the baby, their baby now, in the eyes of the law, was settling down for the evening. "I'd like to share your room," she said. "If that's all right, we don't have to." She felt her face heat. "I understand," Rhett said gently. "And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'll figure that out together." That night, Maddie lay in Rhett's bed, their bed, with his arm draped carefully over her waist, his hand resting protectively on her belly. His breathing was slow and even behind her, and for the first time in months, Maddie felt completely safe. She was married. She had a home. She had a future that didn't involve shame and hiding. But as she drifted off to sleep, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Her father didn't know about the marriage yet. And somehow, Maddie knew that Abel Holt wouldn't take the news well. The warning came 3 days later, carried by a ranch hand Maddie had never seen before. She was in the garden, picking tomatoes in the late afternoon heat, when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Rhett was out checking the fence line in the north pasture. Wouldn't be back until sundown. Maddie straightened as best she could, one hand on her aching back, and watched a young man dismount near the house. "Mrs. Calder?" he called out, looking nervous. The name still gave her a little thrill. "Yes? Name's Billy. I work for the Hendersons, neighbors to your pa's place." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I rode out here soon as I heard. Your father knows about the marriage. He's coming, ma'am. Tomorrow morning," he said. "And he's bringing men with him." Maddie's blood turned to ice. How many men? 4, maybe 5. I heard him talking to Dutch Morgan and his boys. Billy's face was grim. Dutch Morgan was known throughout the territory as a man who hired out his gun to whoever paid. Ma'am, your pa's saying you were coerced, that the marriage ain't legal because you weren't of sound mind. He's talking about taking you back, and the baby when it comes. The basket of tomatoes slipped from Maddie's fingers, thumping into the dirt. He can't do that. I'm married now. I don't think he cares about legal, ma'am. Billy glanced toward the horizon as if expecting to see Abel Holt appear at any moment. I just thought you and Mr. Calder should know what's coming. My ma always said forewarned is forearmed. Thank you, Billy. Maddie forced the words past the fear closing her throat. Tell your mother I'm grateful. After Billy rode off, Maddie stood in the garden, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The baby kicked frantically, sensing her distress, and Maddie placed both hands on her belly, trying to calm herself. Her father was coming. With guns. She'd known this peace couldn't last, had known somewhere deep down that Abel Holt wouldn't let his daughter's defiance stand. But knowing it and facing it were two different things. Maddie made her way to the barn, moving as quickly as her pregnant body would allow. She found Rhett's spare rifle hanging on the wall where he always kept it, pulled it down with shaking hands. The weight was unfamiliar, frightening. She'd never held a gun in her life. Put it back. Maddie spun around to find Rhett standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the setting sun. She hadn't heard him approach, but then again, he moved quiet as a cat when he wanted to. I thought you weren't due back until dark, she said. Saw Billy riding off, figured something was wrong. Rhett walked toward her, his boots crunching on the hay-strewn floor. He gently took the rifle from her hands and returned it to its place on the wall. What did he say? Maddie told him everything. Her father's plan, the hired guns, the claim that she'd been coerced. With each word, Rhett's expression grew harder, his jaw tightening until she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. How many men? He asked when she finished. Billy said 4 or 5, including my father. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes distant, calculating. Then he looked at Maddie, and his expression softened. Go inside. Pack a bag with clothes for you and things for the baby. Enough for a week, maybe 2. You want me to run? Maddie felt something in her chest crack. You're sending me away? No. Rhett's hands came up to frame her face, his callous thumbs stroking her cheeks. But I need to know you have an out if things go bad tomorrow. The Morrisons, the preacher and his wife, they live about 15 miles east. If shooting starts, I want you on a horse heading for their place. They'll keep you safe. And leave you to face 5 men alone? Maddie shook her head fiercely. No, this is my fight, Rhett, my father, my mess. It stopped being just your fight when you became my wife. Rhett's voice was gentle but firm. And I'll be damned if I let anyone, your father included, take you from this ranch. But I also won't risk you or the baby getting caught in crossfire. So what? I'm just supposed to run while you… Maddie's voice broke. I can't lose you. Not now. Not when I've just found you. Rhett pulled her close as her belly would allow, and pressed his lips to her forehead. You won't lose me. I've got no intention of dying tomorrow, Maddie, but I've got even less intention of letting your father drag you back to that hell. He pulled back to look at her. Trust me? Maddie searched his eyes and found only certainty. Whatever happened tomorrow, Rhett Calder would stand between her and her father's wrath. The knowledge should have comforted her, but instead it terrified her. Because she knew her father, knew the depth of his pride and anger, and she knew that pride would demand blood. I trust you, she whispered, but promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't do anything foolish. Define foolish. A ghost of a smile touched Rhett's lips. Because standing between an angry father and his daughter, some might call foolish already. Rhett, Maddie gripped his shirt, promise me. I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure we're both here to meet this baby. He kissed her forehead again, then her cheek, then, briefly, tenderly, her lips. Now go pack that bag. And Maddie, whatever happens tomorrow, remember that you're my wife. In the eyes of God and the law, you're a Calder now. Your father has no claim on you. But as Maddie walked back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that her father didn't care about God or law. He cared about control, about being right, about a daughter who dared to escape his judgment. And men like Abel Holt didn't let go easily. That night, Maddie barely slept. She lay in Rhett's arms, listening to his steady breathing, memorizing the feel of him beside her. He'd tried to comfort her, had whispered reassurances into her hair until she'd pretended to sleep just so he'd stop worrying. But her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept seeing tomorrow play out in 100 different ways, each one ending with Rhett bleeding in the dust or her father dragging her away screaming. The baby sensed her distress and kicked constantly, making rest impossible even if her mind had allowed it. Just before dawn, Rhett's arms tightened around her. "You're not sleeping," he murmured against her neck. "Can't." Maddie turned in his arms to face him. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could barely make out his features, but she could feel the solid strength of him, the warmth. "Rhett, if something happens, nothing's going to happen. But if it does," Maddie pressed her fingers against his lips when he tried to protest. "If it does, I need you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. You've given me more kindness, more respect, more everything than I ever thought I'd have. Whatever happens today, that doesn't change." Rhett caught her hand and brought it to his chest, holding it over his heart. She could feel the steady thump beneath her palm. "Feel that?" he asked. "That's beating for you now, Maddie, for you and that baby, and it's going to keep beating long after your father turns tail and rides off my land." His hand slid to her belly, where the baby was doing its morning gymnastics. "This little one's going to be born right here, in this house, with both of us waiting to meet them. That's a promise." Maddie wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt. They rose with the sun, neither of them mentioning the confrontation that was coming. Rhett made breakfast while Maddie fed the chickens, both of them moving through their morning routine as if this were just another day. But Maddie noticed how Rhett kept glancing toward the horizon, how he'd positioned his rifle near the door, how his movements had taken on a coiled readiness that spoke of a man preparing for violence. By mid-morning, Maddie's nerves were stretched to breaking. She'd packed and repacked her bag 3 times, had cleaned the kitchen twice, had reorganized the pantry just to keep her hands busy. Rhett had saddled a gentle mare and tied Maddie's bag to it, the horse waiting patiently by the barn in case a quick escape became necessary. Then, just as the sun reached its zenith, they came. Maddie saw the dust cloud first, rising on the western horizon like a warning. She'd been standing at the window, unable to stay still, and the sight of it made her breath catch. "Rhett!" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. He appeared from the bedroom, checking the loads in his revolver with practiced efficiency. "I see them. Get ready to ride." "I'm not leaving you." "Maddie, no." She turned from the window to face him, her hands on her swollen belly. "You said I'm your wife." "Well, a wife doesn't abandon her husband when trouble comes. I'm staying." Rhett's jaw clenched, but before he could argue, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. They were here. Through the window, Maddie watched 5 riders approach. Her father rode at the front, his face set in hard lines of righteous fury. Behind him came Dutch Morgan and his 3 boys, mean-looking men with guns strapped to their hips and rifles across their saddles. They looked like exactly what they were: hired violence. "Stay inside," Rhett said quietly. "No matter what happens, you stay inside until I tell you otherwise." He stepped out onto the porch before Maddie could respond, moving with that deceptive laziness that she'd learned meant he was most dangerous. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, where she could see but hopefully not be seen. Abel Holt reined his horse to a stop about 20 feet from the porch. His eyes swept over Rhett with undisguised contempt. "Calder," he said, his voice sharp as broken glass. "I've come for my daughter." "Your daughter's name is Maddie Calder now," Rhett replied, his voice calm and level, "and she's not going anywhere." "That marriage is illegal," Abel spat the words. "She wasn't in her right mind carrying that bastard and all addled by pregnancy. Any judge will see that." "Then take it to a judge." Rhett's hand rested casually on his gun belt, but Maddie could see the tension in his shoulders. "File a complaint, get a court order. But you're not taking her from this ranch without one." Dutch Morgan urged his horse forward, a cruel smile on his weathered face. Now, Mr. Calder, no need for this to get unpleasant. Mr. Holt here just wants his daughter back. You hand her over peaceful-like, and we'll be on our way. Not happening, Rhett's voice hardened. You boys might want to consider riding out. This isn't your fight. We're being paid to make it our fight, Dutch said. He glanced at his sons, all three of whom had their hands drifting toward their guns. And we always earn our money. Abel's face flushed red. Madeline, he shouted toward the house. Get out here. I'm your father and you'll obey me. Before Maddie could stop herself, she was moving toward the door. Rhett's eyes flicked to her, a warning in their depths, but she shook her head slightly. This had to happen. She had to face her father, had to show him that she wasn't the frightened girl he'd traded away. She stepped out onto the porch, one hand on the doorframe for support, the other on her belly. The morning sun was brutal, making her squint, but she could see her father clearly enough, could see the disgust on his face as he looked at her pregnant form. There you are, Abel said, looking even more shameful than when I left you. Get your things. You're coming home. No. The word came out stronger than Maddie expected. I'm not. Don't be foolish, girl. This man has addled your mind with his sweet talk. He doesn't want you. He wants free labor and someone to warm his bed. Soon as that baby's born and you're no longer useful, he'll throw you out. That's not true, Maddie said, but she felt doubt flicker. Was it possible? Had Rhett married her just for the help she could provide? Then Rhett's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a certainty that banished the doubt. He squeezed gently, a silent reassurance. Your daughter is my wife, Rhett said to Abel. Legal and proper, witnessed by Reverend Morrison and recorded in the county register. She stays here because she chooses to, because this is her home now. Home? Abel laughed, harsh and mocking. You think this is a home? This is a prison, just dressed up nicer than the shame she deserves. Madeline, you're coming back where you belong, where I can make sure that bastard child is raised right, in the fear of the Lord. You mean where you can punish me for the rest of my life? Maddie said, her voice shaking but determined. Where you can remind me daily that I'm worthless, that I'm nothing but shame and burden. No, Pa, I won't go back to that. You ungrateful... Abel started to dismount, but Rhett's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Stay on that horse, Holt! Something in Rhett's tone made Abel freeze halfway out of the saddle. The hired guns tensed, hands moving to their weapons. I've been patient, Rhett continued, his voice deadly quiet. I've explained the law. I've told you she's not leaving. Now I'm telling you one last time, turn those horses around and ride off my land. If you come back, I'll treat you like any other trespasser. You threatening me, Calder? Abel was back in his saddle now, his face purple with rage. You think you can take all 5 of us? Don't know, Rhett said calmly, but I guarantee you'll be the first to find out. His hand moved to his gun in a blur of motion, the weapon clearing leather and pointing directly at Abel's chest before any of the hired guns could react. Question is, are you willing to die to prove a point? The tableau held. 5 men on horses, 1 man on a porch with a gun, and Maddie standing beside him with her heart in her throat. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the grass and the nervous shifting of the horses. Dutch Morgan cleared his throat. Mr. Holt, maybe we should reconsider this. Man defending his wife, that's legal. We push this and we're the ones breaking the law. I paid you to do a job, Abel snapped. You paid us to help retrieve your daughter, not to get shot over a legal marriage. Dutch's eyes never left Rhett's gun. There's a difference. One of Dutch's sons spoke up, his voice nervous. Pa's right, Mr. Holt. This ain't what we signed on for. Abel looked at each of his hired guns in turn, seeing the same message in their faces. They weren't willing to die for his wounded pride. His face contorted with rage and humiliation. Fine, he spat. Keep the whore. But mark my words, Calder, this isn't over. That baby she's carrying is my blood, and I'll see it raised proper one way or another. That baby is mine, Rhett said, his voice hard as iron. In the eyes of the law and in every way that matters. And if you or anyone else tries to harm one hair on their head, I'll put you in the ground. That's not a threat, Holt. That's a promise. Abel jerked his horse's rein so hard the animal whinnied in protest. You're a fool, Calder. She'll ruin you like she's ruined... everything she's ever touched. And when she does, don't come crying to me. With that, Abel wheeled his horse around and spurted into a gallop. Dutch and his boys followed, though at a more reasonable pace, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Maddie watched them go, her whole body trembling. When they disappeared over the horizon, her legs gave out. Rhett caught her before she hit the porch, his gun somehow already holstered, and lowered her gently to sit on the steps. "Breathe," he murmured, his hand rubbing circles on her back. "Just breathe, Maddie." "He'll come back," Maddie gasped out between ragged breaths. "You heard him. He'll find another way." "Let him try." Rhett's voice was grim. "But he won't catch us unprepared again." Maddie looked up at him. This man who'd faced down 5 armed men without flinching, who'd claimed her baby as his own, who'd promised to put her father in the ground if necessary. "You really meant it? About the baby being yours?" "Every word." Rhett helped her to her feet, his hands gentle despite their strength. "That child's going to carry my name, going to call me father. Your pa has no claim, legal or otherwise." The baby kicked hard, as if in agreement, and Maddie let out a watery laugh. "I think they heard you." "Good. Better they know from the start who their real father is." Rhett's hand joined hers on her belly. "Come on, let's get you inside. You've had enough excitement for one day." But as they turned toward the house, Maddie caught sight of something on the horizon. A lone rider, approaching fast from the east. Her heart lurched. "Rhett!" He'd already seen it, his hand dropping to his gun again. They waited, tense, as the rider drew closer. But as the figure resolved into focus, Maddie saw it was Reverend Morrison, his old horse laboring under the pace. The Reverend pulled up short, breathing hard. "Saw Holt and his men riding hell-bent toward town. Thought I'd better check on you folks." "We're fine," Rhett said. "They left without bloodshed." "Thank the Lord." Reverend Morrison dismounted stiffly. "But I'm not sure they'll stay gone. Holt was in a foul mood at the saloon last night, drinking and talking about his rights as a father. There's bad blood there, Rhett. The kind that doesn't wash away easy." "I know." Rhett's jaw tightened. "But Maddie's my wife now. I'll protect what's mine." Reverend Morrison looked at Maddie, his old eyes kind. "How are you holding up, child?" Maddie stopped, unsure how to answer. Terrified? Relieved? Exhausted? All of those and more. "I'm alive. We both are. That's what matters." "That baby coming soon?" The Reverend nodded at her belly. "Few weeks," the midwife said when I saw her last month. "Well, when the time comes, you send for me. I'd like to be there to meet the newest Calder." He smiled warmly. "And to make sure this stubborn fool takes proper care of you both." After the Reverend left, promising to keep his ear to the ground for news of Abel's next move, Maddie finally allowed herself to collapse. The adrenaline that had kept her standing drained away all at once, leaving her shaking and weak. Rhett carried her to bed despite her protests, tucking her in like she was made of spun glass. "Rest," he ordered gently. "You've been through hell today." "So have you," Maddie pointed out. "You're the one who faced down 5 guns." "I've faced worse." Rhett sat on the edge of the bed, his hand covering hers. "But I've never had more to lose." The weight of those words settled over Maddie like a blanket. She'd spent so long feeling worthless, being told she was worthless, that the idea of being precious to someone still felt foreign. But as she looked at Rhett, at the concern in his eyes, the protective set of his shoulders, the gentle way he held her hand, she began to believe it might be true. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we wait," Rhett said. "We prepare. I'll ride to the neighboring ranches tomorrow, let them know what's happening. Most of the folks around here are decent. They won't stand for Holt trying to steal a man's wife." He paused. "And we get ready for that baby, because whether your father likes it or not, in a few weeks you're going to be a mother. And I'm going to be a father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Maddie's hand moved to her belly, where the baby, their baby, was finally settling down. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of my father, of childbirth, of being a mother, all of it." "Fear's natural," Rhett said. "But you're not alone in it anymore, Maddie. Whatever comes, we face it together." That night, as Maddie drifted toward an exhausted sleep in Rhett's arms, she thought about her father's parting words. That she'd ruin Rhett, that she ruined everything she touched. Maybe Abel was right. Maybe she would bring nothing but trouble to this quiet ranch and the man who'd offered her sanctuary. But as Rhett's arm tightened around her waist, his hand protective over her belly, even in sleep, Maddie found herself thinking that some things were worth the risk. Some people were worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, she was one of them. The contraction started 3 days later, in the deep velvet darkness before dawn. Maddie woke to a tightening across her belly that was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. This one had teeth, a sharp insistence that made her breath catch. She lay still, counting the seconds until it passed, then placed her hand on Rhett's shoulder. "Rhett," she whispered, "I think it's time." He was awake instantly, that soldier's awareness she'd noticed before. "You're sure?" Another contraction rolled through her, stronger this time, and Maddie gripped his arm hard enough to leave marks. "I'm sure." What followed was controlled chaos. Rhett lit the lamps, stoked the fire to boiling, and sent their nearest neighbor's son, a boy who'd been sleeping in the barn as extra protection since Abel's visit, riding hard for the midwife in town. He moved with swift efficiency, but Maddie could see the fear beneath his calm exterior. "Anna went into labor at dawn, too," he said quietly as he helped Maddie out of bed. "I keep telling myself this is different, that you're stronger, that we're prepared, but I'm terrified too," Maddie admitted, another contraction stealing her breath. When it passed, she looked at Rhett, really looked at him. "But I'm not Anna, and you're not alone this time." Something shifted in Rhett's eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "You're right. We're going to do this together, and it's going to be fine." But as the morning wore on and the contractions grew stronger, Maddie began to understand why women feared childbirth. The pain was unlike anything she'd experienced. Waves of agony that started in her back and wrapped around to her belly, each one worse than the last. Between contractions, she paced the cabin, trying to find a position that offered relief. Rhett stayed close, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of pain. He held her when she needed support, gave her space when she needed to move, and never once left the cabin despite the fear she could see etched in every line of his face. "Where's the midwife?" Maddie gasped as another contraction peaked. The sun was fully up now, had been for hours, and there was still no sign of help. "She'll be here," Rhett promised, his hands steadying her as she swayed. "Mrs. Patterson knows these roads better than anyone." But another hour passed, then 2, and still no midwife. The contractions were coming faster now, harder, and Maddie could feel her body preparing for the final push whether she was ready or not. "Rhett," she panted, gripping the back of a chair so hard her knuckles went white. "I don't think we can wait. The baby's coming." She saw panic flash across his face, quickly suppressed. All right, we can do this. I helped birth calves, and I was there when Anna—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I know what to do." Maddie wanted to laugh at the comparison to livestock, but another contraction hit, and all she could do was cry out. Rhett was beside her immediately, supporting her weight as her legs threatened to give out. "Let's get you to the bed," he said, guiding her to the bedroom. "Nice and slow." The next hour blurred into a haze of pain and pressure. Rhett had rolled up his sleeves, had water boiling and clean linens ready, had transformed from protective husband into something between midwife and battlefield surgeon. He knelt at the foot of the bed, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he checked her progress. "You're doing so well, Maddie," he kept saying, his voice steady even though sweat beaded on his forehead. "Just a little longer." But Maddie was exhausted, her body wrung out from hours of labor. When the urge to push finally came, she wasn't sure she had the strength left. "I can't," she sobbed. "Rhett, I can't do this." "Yes, you can." He moved up beside her, wiping her sweat-soaked hair from her face. "You're the strongest person I know. You survived your father, survived being thrown away, survived starting over with nothing. You can survive this." "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby—" "Nothing's going wrong." Rhett's voice was fierce, certain. "You're going to push, and I'm going to catch our baby, and we're both going to be here to tell them this story someday. You hear me?" The next contraction built, and this time Maddie bore down with everything she had. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the cabin walls, and felt something shift. That's it. Rhett was back at the foot of the bed, his eyes wide. I can see the head. One more push, Maddie. Just one more. She didn't think she had another push in her. Her body felt like it had been split open, every muscle screaming in protest. But then she thought about her father, about all the times he told her she was weak, worthless, too broken to amount to anything. And she pushed anyway. The sensation was both terrible and transcendent, a tearing, burning pressure followed by sudden, shocking relief. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, Maddie heard it, a thin, reedy wail that quickly strengthened into a full-throated cry. "It's a girl," Rhett said, his voice breaking on the words. "Maddie, we have a daughter." Maddie struggled to sit up, desperate to see. Rhett was cradling the baby in his large hands, the tiny body red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. He was crying openly now, tears streaming down his weathered face as he stared at the child with something like wonder. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "just like her mother." He laid the baby on Maddie's chest, and the weight of her, solid and real and alive, made everything else fall away. The pain, the fear, the months of shame and rejection. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was this tiny life, this impossible miracle. The baby's cries quieted as she felt Maddie's skin, her small face turning toward her mother's heartbeat. Maddie touched the soft down of dark hair, the impossibly tiny fingers that immediately gripped her thumb with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," Maddie breathed. "I'm your mama." Rhett worked quickly to tie and cut the cord, to clean up and make sure Maddie was all right. His hands shook slightly as he worked, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. When everything was settled, he sank onto the bed beside Maddie, his arm around her shoulders, both of them staring at the baby with awe. "I didn't know it could be like this," Rhett said softly. "With Anna, everything happened so fast, and by the time I realized something was wrong..." He stopped, took a shaky breath. "But this was everything I imagined it could be." "You saved us," Maddie said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known what to do, you saved yourself." Rhett pressed a kiss to her temple. "I just helped." The baby made a small sound, her face scrunching up in what might have been the beginning of another cry. Maddie adjusted her hold, and the infant settled again, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "What should we name her?" Rhett asked. Maddie had thought about this over the past weeks, had considered names that honored Rhett's late wife or his mother, but looking at her daughter now, she knew exactly what felt right. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Rhett's arm tightened around her. Hope called her. "It's perfect." They stayed like that for a long time. The three of them cocooned in the quiet cabin while the sun climbed higher in the sky. Outside, they heard hoofbeats and voices. Mrs. Patterson, the midwife, had finally arrived, along with Reverend Morrison and several neighbors who'd heard the news. But for this moment, they were alone. A family, brand new and fragile and already fierce with love. Mrs. Patterson bustled in, full of apologies about a washed-out bridge that had delayed her, but she stopped short when she saw Maddie holding the baby, Rhett beside them both with tears still wet on his face. "Well," she said, her stern expression softening, "looks like you managed just fine without me." She checked them both over, pronounced Hope healthy and Maddie recovering well, and showed them how to get the baby to nurse. When Hope finally latched, her small mouth working instinctively, Maddie felt something settle deep in her chest. This was what she'd been meant for. Not to be small and decorative, not to apologize for taking up space, but to be strong enough to bring life into the world and fierce enough to protect it. The neighbors who'd gathered brought food and well wishes, though Rhett made sure they didn't stay long. "Mother and baby need rest," he said firmly, ushering them out despite their protests that they wanted to properly meet little Hope. When they were finally alone again, evening shadows lengthening across the floor, Maddie fed Hope and watched as Rhett carefully changed the baby's cloth diaper with hands that looked absurdly large against such a tiny body. "You're good at this," Maddie observed. "Had a lot of practice with calves," Rhett said, then grinned at Maddie's expression. "But I promise I'll stop comparing our daughter to livestock." "Our daughter," Maddie repeated, testing the words. "You really mean that? She's yours." Rhett finished with the diaper and lifted Hope, cradling her against his broad chest. The baby looked impossibly small in his arms, but completely safe. He looked at Maddie with those steady gray blue eyes. "She's mine in every way that counts," he said. "I was there when she came into this world. I'll be there for every step she takes, every scraped knee, every tear in triumph. Biology doesn't make a father, Maddie. Love does. And I already love her more than I thought possible." Maddie felt tears sting her eyes. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You didn't have to deserve it. You just had to be you." Rhett sat on the edge of the bed, still holding Hope. Brave and stubborn and beautiful, even when you couldn't see it yourself. They fell into an exhausted sleep as darkness fell. Hope nestled between them in a nest of blankets. Maddie's body ached in ways she'd never imagined, but her heart felt fuller than it ever had. She woke several times during the night to feed Hope, marveling each time at the perfect reality of her daughter. Rhett woke too, changing diapers and walking the baby when she fussed, humming old songs in his deep voice until Hope settled back to sleep. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Maddie felt like they'd lived a lifetime in the span of 24 hours. She was a mother now. Hope was here, real and healthy. They'd survived. But as she lay there in the early morning light, listening to Rhett's quiet breathing and Hope's small snuffling sounds, Maddie couldn't shake the memory of her father's words. "That baby is my blood, and I'll see it raised proper one way or another." She'd thought the confrontation 3 days ago had been the end of it, that Abel had accepted defeat and would leave them in peace. But as Hope stirred and began to fuss, as Maddie brought her daughter to her breast and felt that fierce, protective love surge through her, she knew with cold certainty that her father wouldn't let this go. Abel Holt didn't accept defeat. He never had. And now there was a baby, his granddaughter, whether he acknowledged the marriage or not. And Maddie knew her father well enough to know he'd see Hope as something to be controlled, molded, saved from her mother's influence. "You're thinking too loud," Rhett murmured, his eyes still closed but his hand finding hers on the blanket. "I can practically hear your mind spinning." "I'm scared," Maddie admitted. "Not for me, but for Hope. My father is not going to touch her." Rhett's eyes opened and there was steel in them. "I meant what I said, Maddie. I'll put him in the ground before I let him harm either of you." "I don't want you to have to," Maddie said. "I don't want Hope growing up knowing her grandfather died because of her." "He won't die because of her. He'll die because of his own pride and meanness if it comes to that." Rhett sat up, running a hand through his hair. "But maybe it won't come to that. Maybe now that the baby's here and healthy, maybe seeing that Hope has a good home and parents who love her, maybe that'll be enough." Maddie wanted to believe it, but she'd seen the look in her father's eyes 3 days ago, the cold rage, the wounded pride. Men like Abel didn't change their minds just because a baby was born. The next week passed in a blur of feeding and changing and learning to be parents. Hope was a good baby, as far as Maddie could tell, with nothing to compare her to. She slept in short bursts, waking to eat and be held, and seemed content as long as someone was near. Rhett was a revelation as a father. Despite his size and rough exterior, he handled Hope with infinite gentleness. He'd carved a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and positioned it beside their bed so they could reach the baby in the night. He sang to her in the evenings, his deep voice rumbling through songs Maddie suspected he was making up as he went. And he looked at Hope the way he'd started looking at Maddie, like she hung the moon and stars. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said one evening, holding Hope while Maddie ate dinner with both hands for the first time in days. "A family. A reason to come home at night." "You have us," Maddie said simply, "for as long as you want us." "That's going to be a long time then." Rhett's smile was soft, genuine. "Like maybe forever." The peace lasted exactly 9 days. On the 9th day after Hope's birth, while Maddie was nursing the baby on the porch in the warm afternoon sun, she saw a lone rider approaching from town. Not her father this time. The figure was too slight, the horse too fine. As the rider drew closer, Maddie's stomach sank. It was Sheriff Coleman, Cinder Creek's lawman for the past 15 years. Rhett appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression guarded. "Sheriff," he called out, "what brings you out this way?" Sheriff Coleman dismounted, his weathered face apologetic. "Afternoon, Rhett. Mrs. Calder." He nodded at Maddie, his eyes flicking to the bundle in her arms. "Congratulations on the baby." "Thank you," Maddie said carefully. "Is something wrong?" The sheriff sighed, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a folded paper. "I'm afraid I've got a court summons here. Abel Holt is filing for custody of the child, claiming his daughter was coerced into marriage while not of sound mind, and that the child is being raised in an unsuitable environment." The words hit Maddie like a physical blow. She pulled Hope closer, her arms instinctively tightening around her daughter. "That's insane," Rhett said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Maddie was of perfectly sound mind when we married. Reverend Morrison witnessed the whole thing." "I know, Rhett, I know." The sheriff looked genuinely troubled. "But Holt's got himself a lawyer from Cheyenne, and they're making a case that your marriage happened under duress, that Maddie had no other options, and therefore couldn't freely consent. They're also claiming that as the child's grandfather and only blood relative capable of providing a proper home, he has a right to custody." "Hope has a proper home," Maddie said, her voice shaking with fury. "She has two parents who love her, a roof over her head, food and warmth. What more could she possibly need?" "I agree with you, ma'am, but it's not my call to make." Sheriff Coleman handed the summons to Rhett. "There's a hearing set for 2 weeks from today. You'll need to appear before Judge Harrison in Cinder Creek and make your case." After the sheriff left, Maddie sat on the porch steps, still holding Hope, and let the tears come. All of this, the peace, the happiness, the fragile sense of family they'd built, it could all be taken away by her father's vindictive pride. Rhett knelt in front of her, his hands covering hers on Hope's small back. "We're going to fight this," he said. "We'll get a lawyer, we'll testify, we'll bring in witnesses. Reverend Morrison, Mrs. Patterson, everyone who's seen us together. The judge will see that Hope belongs with us." "What if he doesn't?" Maddie looked at him, fear making her voice small. "What if my father convinces them that I'm unfit, that you only married me out of pity? What if they take her, Rhett?" "They won't." But Maddie could hear the doubt beneath his certainty. "I won't let them." That night, after Hope was asleep in her cradle, Rhett and Maddie sat at the kitchen table making plans. They'd need witnesses, character references, proof that their marriage was legitimate and their home was suitable. Rhett would ride to town in the morning to hire a lawyer, someone who could navigate the legal complexities better than they could. But as Maddie lay in bed later, listening to Hope's soft breathing and Rhett's restless tossing beside her, she couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her bones. Her father had power in Cinder Creek, land, money, respect. What did she have? A hastily arranged marriage, a body that the town had always mocked, a past that everyone knew. Maybe Abel was right. Maybe she would ruin everything she touched, including this beautiful life she'd managed to build. "Stop it," Rhett said in the darkness. "I can hear you doubting yourself from here." "How can I not?" Maddie whispered. "My father's going to stand up in front of that judge and paint me as exactly what the town's always thought I was. A desperate fat girl who trapped you into marriage and isn't fit to raise a child. And they'll believe him, Rhett, because that's what they want to believe." Rhett rolled over to face her, his hand finding her face in the darkness. "Then we'll prove them wrong. We'll show them what a real family looks like. Not perfect, maybe, but honest and loving and strong. We'll show them that you're the best mother Hope could possibly have." "How?" The word came out broken. "How do we prove that in 2 weeks?" "We start by believing it ourselves," Rhett said. "And then we walk into that courtroom with our heads high and tell the truth. That we chose each other, that we built this home together, that Hope is loved and safe and cherished. The rest will take care of itself." Maddie wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative, losing Hope, watching her father take away the only good thing she'd ever had, was too terrible to contemplate. She pressed closer to Rhett, drawing strength from his solid presence, and listened to their daughter breathe in the darkness. Hope. They'd named her Hope for a reason, and Maddie was going to fight like hell to make sure that hope became reality, no matter what her father threw at them. because she wasn't the frightened girl who'd been handed over at that fence line anymore. She was a mother now, and a wife, and a woman who'd survived hell and came out stronger. And if Abel Holt thought he could take her child without a fight, he was about to learn just how fierce a mother's love could be. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a strange, suspended state between hope and dread. Rhett hired a lawyer from Laramie, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Wells who'd made a name for herself defending unpopular cases. She rode out to the ranch 3 days after they received the summons, her gray traveling suit dusty from the road, but her eyes keen as she looked around the homestead. "Show me everything," she said without preamble. "The house, the land, how you live. I need to know what we're working with." Maddie led her through the cabin, pointing out the cradle Rhett had carved, the kitchen garden she tended, the shelves lined with preserved vegetables for winter. Hope was awake, nestled in Maddie's arms, and Mrs. Wells paused to study the baby with an unreadable expression. "She's healthy?" the lawyer asked. "Very," Maddie said. "Mrs. Patterson, the midwife, can testify to that." "Good. We'll need her testimony." Mrs. Wells pulled out a notebook and began writing. "Tell me about the marriage. Every detail, from the moment your father brought you here to the day you said your vows." Over the next hour, Maddie told the story. Her father's disgust, the transaction at the fence line, Rhett's unexpected kindness. She didn't hide anything, not the pregnancy or Thomas Fletcher's abandonment or her own fears that she'd been nothing but a burden taken in out of pity. Mrs. Wells listened without interrupting, her pen scratching across the pages. When Maddie finished, the lawyer looked up with something like approval in her eyes. "That's good," she said. "Honest, vulnerable, but showing strength. That's what we need." She turned to Rhett, who'd been standing quietly by the door. "Now you. Why did you marry her?" Rhett met her gaze steadily. "Because I saw a woman who needed help, and I had help to give. Because I was tired of being alone. Because—" He paused, looking at Maddie with an expression that made her breath catch. "Because from the first moment she stepped onto this ranch, she made it feel like a home again. And the child? You claim her as yours?" "She is mine," Rhett said, his voice firm. "Not by blood, maybe, but in every way that counts. I was there when she was born, held her mother through labor, cut the cord. I've changed her diapers and walked her at night and promised to protect her with my life. That makes me her father." Mrs. Wells scribbled more notes. "The prosecution will argue that you only married Mrs. Calder to get free labor, that the marriage was one of convenience rather than genuine affection. They'll say a child deserves to be raised by blood family in a proper household, not by a man who took her mother in out of practicality." "Then they'd be wrong," Maddie said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Rhett has shown me more genuine affection and respect in these few months than my father did in 23 years. Hope is loved here. She's wanted. Can my father say the same? He wanted to throw me away when I was pregnant with her. What kind of home would that be?" "That's exactly what you need to say in court." Mrs. Wells snapped her notebook shut. "The hearing is in 11 days. Between now and then, I want you both to keep detailed records of your daily routine. Show me that this is a stable, loving household, and I'll gather testimonies from your neighbors, the Reverend, the midwife. We'll build a case that even Judge Harrison can't ignore." After she left, Maddie felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe they could win this. Maybe the truth would be enough. But 3 days before the hearing, Abel made his move. Maddie was in the garden with Hope sleeping in a basket nearby when she heard horses approaching. Her heart stuttered. They'd had no warning this time, no friendly neighbor riding ahead with news. She scooped up Hope and ran for the house, calling for Rhett. He emerged from the barn at a run, rifle in hand, but skidded to a stop when he saw who was riding up the path. It wasn't Abel and hired guns this time. It was Reverend Morrison, Sheriff Coleman, and a woman Maddie didn't recognize, well-dressed, severe-looking, with a leather satchel clutched in her gloved hands. "Mrs. Calder," the sheriff said, dismounting with visible reluctance. "This is Mrs. Harriet Blackwood from the Territorial Child Welfare Office. She's here to inspect the home and evaluate whether it's suitable for raising a child." The woman, Mrs. Blackwood, looked at Maddie with barely concealed disdain, her eyes traveling from Maddie's work-worn dress to her disheveled hair to the baby in her arms. "Mr. Holt filed a complaint alleging neglect and unsuitable living conditions. I'm here to investigate." There's no neglect, Rhett said, his voice hard. Our daughter is perfectly cared for. I'll be the judge of that. Mrs. Blackwood pushed past them into the house, and Maddie felt violation crawl across her skin. This woman, this stranger, walking through their home with judgment in every glance. She watched as Mrs. Blackwood examined everything, running her finger along surfaces, checking for dust, opening cupboards to inspect their food stores, even pulling back the blankets on Hope's cradle to check the bedding. All the while, she made notes in a small book, her expression growing more pinched with each room. The child sleeps in your bedroom? Mrs. Blackwood asked, her tone suggesting this was somehow scandalous. She's 2 weeks old, Maddie said, struggling to keep her voice even. Of course she sleeps near us. She needs to nurse every few hours. And you nurse her yourself? You haven't hired a wet nurse? We can't afford a wet nurse, and even if we could, I want to feed my own daughter. Maddie held Hope closer. Is that a crime? Mrs. Blackwood's lips thinned. Your tone suggests a lack of respect for authority, Mrs. Calder. That's noted. The inspection continued for another excruciating hour. Mrs. Blackwood found fault with everything. The cabin was too small, too isolated, too rustic for raising a proper young lady. Maddie's hands were too rough, evidence of manual labor that was unseemly for a mother. The fact that they had no other family nearby was concerning. Even Hope herself came under scrutiny, with Mrs. Blackwood insisting on unwrapping her to check for signs of neglect or injury. She's perfect, Maddie said fiercely as the woman examined her daughter. She's healthy and loved and cared for. That remains to be seen. Mrs. Blackwood rewrapped Hope with clinical efficiency and handed her back to Maddie. I'll be filing my report with the court. Judge Harrison will review it before the hearing. After she left, Maddie sank into a chair. Hope clutched to her chest and felt the last of her hope crumble. She's going to recommend they take Hope away. You saw her face. She'd already decided before she even arrived. We don't know that, Rhett said, but his expression was grim. Reverend Morrison, who'd stayed behind, shook his head sadly. I'm afraid Maddie might be right. Mrs. Blackwood has a reputation. She believes children belong with blood relatives in traditional households, and she's very rigid in her views. This is Abel's doing, Maddie said, anger rising to burn away the fear. He knew exactly who to call, how to stack the deck against us. Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably. For what it's worth, I think it's a load of horse shit. Pardon my language, ma'am, but I've seen how you two are with that baby, and it's clear as day she's loved. I'll testify to that if it helps. Thank you, Sheriff, Rhett said quietly. We'll take all the help we can get. The night before the hearing, Maddie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed watching Hope sleep in her cradle, memorizing every detail of her daughter's face. The small nose, the rosebud mouth, the way her tiny fists curled beside her head. What if this was the last night she got to hold her baby? What if tomorrow the judge decided Abel was right, that Maddie was unfit, that Hope belonged in her grandfather's cold, cruel hands? Come here, Rhett said softly, pulling Maddie against his chest. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. I can't lose her, Maddie whispered. She's everything, Rhett. She's the first good thing I've ever had that was truly mine. She's ours, Rhett corrected, and we're not going to lose her. We're going to walk into that courtroom, tell the truth, and trust that justice will prevail. What if it doesn't? What if the truth isn't enough? Rhett was quiet for a long moment, then, if the judge rules against us, we take Hope and we run. Head west to California or north to Montana, somewhere they can't find us. Maddie pulled back to look at him. You'd give up everything? This ranch? Your life here? This ranch is just land and buildings, Rhett said fiercely. You and Hope. You're my life. I'd burn it all down before I'd let them take you from me. Maddie kissed him then, pouring all her fear and love and gratitude into it. When they finally pulled apart, Hope had started to fuss, and Maddie lifted her daughter to nurse one more time before dawn. The courtroom in Cinder Creek was packed when they arrived the next morning. It seemed like half the town had turned out to witness the spectacle. Maddie Holt, the disgraced daughter, fighting her own father for custody of her bastard child. The whispers started the moment she walked through the door with Hope in her arms and Rhett at her side. Abel sat at the plaintiff's table with his expensive lawyer from Cheyenne. A slick man in a fine suit who looked at Maddie like she was something scraped off his shoe. Mrs. Blackwood sat nearby, her report prominently displayed on the table. Judge Harrison entered, a stern man in his 60s who'd presided over Cinder Creek's legal matters for decades. He called the court to order and listened as Abel's lawyer laid out the case against Maddie and Rhett. Your Honor, we're here today because an innocent child is being raised in unsuitable conditions by a mother who is demonstrably unfit and a man who married her under suspicious circumstances. The lawyer's voice was smooth, persuasive. Abel Holt, the child's grandfather and only blood relative, is prepared to provide the proper home this girl deserves, a home with family connections, social standing, and moral guidance. He went on, painting a picture of Maddie as desperate and unstable, of Rhett as an opportunist who'd taken advantage of a woman in crisis. He cited Mrs. Blackwood's report, which apparently found the ranch inadequate for child rearing, and expressed concerns about Maddie's emotional fitness. Then Abel himself took the stand, and Maddie had to listen as her father systematically destroyed her character. My daughter has always been troubled, Your Honor, Abel said, his voice dripping with false concern. Impulsive, emotional, prone to poor judgment. When she came home pregnant by some man who wanted nothing to do with her, I tried to help. I arranged for her to go somewhere she could work and have the baby in peace, but she's twisted that into some story of abandonment. You handed me over like livestock, Maddie said before she could stop herself. Mrs. Wells put a warning hand on her arm, but the damage was done. Outburst in my court, Mrs. Calder, Judge Harrison said sternly. You'll have your turn to speak. Abel continued, painting himself as a concerned father whose daughter had been manipulated into marriage by a lonely rancher. He claimed he only wanted what was best for his granddaughter, a proper upbringing, education, social connections, everything Maddie and Rhett supposedly couldn't provide. When it was their turn, Mrs. Wells called her witnesses. Reverend Morrison testified about the wedding, about how Maddie had clearly been willing and of sound mind. Mrs. Patterson described the birth, how Rhett had been present and caring, how both parents were devoted to their daughter. Sheriff Coleman spoke about visiting the ranch, seeing the love and care evident in every corner. But Maddie could see the doubt in Judge Harrison's eyes. These were good people vouching for them, yes, but against Abel's money and Mrs. Blackwood's official report, would it be enough? Finally, Mrs. Wells called Maddie to the stand. Mrs. Calder, she began gently, tell the court in your own words about your marriage to Rhett Calder. Maddie took a deep breath, looking out at the crowded courtroom. She saw Abel's smug expression, saw the town gossips leaning forward eagerly, saw Rhett's steady, encouraging gaze, and she told the truth. My father brought me to Rhett's fence line when I was 7 months pregnant and handed me over like I was property he wanted to be rid of, she said, her voice gaining strength. He told me I was a disgrace, that I'd shamed the family, that I deserved whatever I got. I was terrified. I thought Rhett would treat me the same way, with contempt and cruelty. But he didn't. She looked at Rhett, saw him nod encouragement. He gave me my own room. He fed me, clothed me, never once made me feel ashamed of my body or my condition. He taught me ranch work, treated me like a partner instead of a servant. And when I went into labor, he stayed with me through every contraction, delivered my daughter with his own hands, and wept when he held her for the first time. Maddie's voice broke. He's been more of a father to Hope in 2 weeks than my own father was to me in 23 years. And the marriage? Mrs. Wells prompted. Was it forced? No, Maddie said firmly. Rhett asked me to marry him, and I said yes because I wanted to, because he made me feel safe for the first time in my life, because I was falling in love with him, even if I was too scared to admit it. Abel's lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is clearly the testimony of a woman who doesn't understand her own desperation drove these decisions. I understand perfectly, Maddie interrupted, turning to look directly at her father. I understand that you never loved me, that my weight, my imperfections, my existence was always an embarrassment to you. That when I got pregnant, you saw it as the final proof that I was worthless. But Rhett saw something different. He saw a person worth fighting for. She stood then, still holding Hope, and addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm perfect. I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong man. got pregnant outside marriage, brought shame on my family. But I'm a good mother. I love my daughter more than anything in this world. And Rhett," her voice softened, "Rhett is the best father Hope could ever have, blood or not. If you take her from us, you're not protecting her. You're punishing her for my mistakes. And she deserves better than that." The courtroom was silent when Maddie finished. She returned to her seat, legs shaking, and felt Rhett's hand close over hers. Then the judge called Abel to respond, and Maddie's father stood with righteous fury burning in his eyes. "You want to talk about love?" he said, his voice shaking. "I loved you, Madeline. Raised you after your mother died, put food on the table, tried to teach you right from wrong. And this is how you repay me? By running off with the first man who'd have you? By keeping my granddaughter from me?" "You don't want Hope," Maddie said, rising to face him despite Mrs. Wells' attempts to keep her seated. "You want to control me. You want to punish me. That's all this has ever been about. I want to save that child from becoming like you." Abel's mask finally cracked, revealing the venom beneath. "Fat, foolish, throwing herself at any man who shows her kindness. I won't let my granddaughter grow up thinking that's acceptable. She deserves to be raised with dignity, with standards, with cruelty?" Rhett's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. He stood, his size making even the judge look small. "Because that's what you're describing. Raising a child to hate herself, to think her worth is tied to her size or her mistakes. That's not dignity. That's abuse." "How dare you?" Abel started, but Rhett wasn't finished. "I dare because I've seen what your love did to Maddie. The scars it left, the way she flinches when she thinks she's done something wrong, the way she apologizes for taking up space, the way she couldn't believe anyone would want her." Rhett's voice was rough with emotion. "It took weeks for her to understand that she was worthy of kindness. That's what your parenting did." He walked forward, standing between Maddie and her father like a wall. "You want Hope? You'll have to go through me. And I promise you, Holt, I won't go down easy." Judge Harrison banged his gavel. "Mr. Calder, threats in my courtroom." "It's not a threat, Your Honor. It's a fact." Rhett turned to face the judge. "I love my wife, I love my daughter, and I will do whatever it takes to protect them both. If that means running, we'll run. If it means fighting, we'll fight. But I will not let this man destroy another life with his poison." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Abel's face went purple with rage, and Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, looking between Maddie, Rhett, Abel, and the baby sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "Enough," he said finally. "I've heard enough. I'm calling a 30-minute recess to review the testimony and evidence. Court is adjourned." Those 30 minutes felt like 30 years. Maddie paced in the small anteroom while Mrs. Wells tried to reassure her, and Rhett stood guard at the door, watching for any sign of Abel trying to approach. "You did well in there," Mrs. Wells said. "Both of you. You showed the truth of your relationship, your commitment to Hope." "But will it be enough?" Maddie asked, bouncing Hope gently as the baby started to fuss. "Abel has money, connections, that damned report from Mrs. Blackwood. And you have love," Mrs. Wells interrupted. "Don't underestimate that. Judge Harrison is a fair man. He'll see what's real." When they were called back into the courtroom, Maddie felt like she might vomit. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. Judge Harrison looked at them all with an unreadable expression. "I've reviewed all the testimony and evidence presented today," he began, "and I've come to a decision." Maddie gripped Rhett's hand so hard her fingers ached. "Mr. Holt, your concerns about your daughter's marriage and living situation are noted. However, after hearing the testimony, I find no evidence that Mrs. Calder was coerced or is unfit to be a mother. The marriage appears to be legitimate and entered into willingly by both parties." Hope flickered in Maddie's chest. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "while Mrs. Blackwood's report raises some concerns about the rustic nature of the Calder Ranch, I find those concerns insufficient to warrant removing a child from a home where she is clearly loved and well cared for." Abel half rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I'm not finished, Mr. Holt." Judge Harrison's voice was stern. "I've also heard testimony about your treatment of your daughter when she came to you pregnant and afraid. The way you describe her, the words you use, they suggest a deep lack of respect and compassion. That gives me significant pause about your suitability as a guardian." The judge looked at Maddie and Rhett. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the defendants. Hope Calder will remain in the custody of her parents, Madeline and Rhett Calder. Mr. Holt, your petition for custody is denied. The courtroom exploded. Maddie heard the verdict but couldn't quite process it. They'd won? Hope was theirs to keep? Abel was on his feet shouting at the judge, but his words were drowned out by the bang of the gavel. My decision is final, Mr. Holt. Any further harassment of the Calders will result in legal consequences. This court is adjourned. Maddie collapsed into Rhett's arms, sobbing with relief, while Hope wailed at all the noise. Around them, people were talking, some congratulating them, others muttering disapprovingly. Maddie didn't care. They'd won. Hope was safe. When she finally pulled back to look at Rhett, she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. We did it, he whispered. She's ours. She always was, Maddie said, and kissed him right there in the courtroom, not caring who saw. Abel left without speaking to them, his lawyer trailing behind with promises to appeal that everyone knew were empty. Mrs. Blackwood sniffed disapprovingly, but said nothing. And slowly the courtroom cleared until it was just Maddie, Rhett, Hope, and Mrs. Wells. Congratulations, the lawyer said, packing up her papers. You've got a beautiful family. Don't let anyone tell you different. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them too emotionally wrung out for words. But as the homestead came into view, Maddie felt something settle in her chest, a sense of belonging, of rightness. This was home. Not because of the building or the land, but because of the people in it. The summer turned to autumn, and autumn to winter, and life on the Calder Ranch found its rhythm. Hope grew from a tiny newborn into a robust baby with Maddie's dark eyes and what looked like it might be Rhett's stubborn chin. She laughed when Rhett sang to her, reached for Maddie whenever she entered the room, and generally ruled the household with tiny, imperious fists. Abel made no further attempts to contact them. The last they heard, he'd sold his ranch and moved east, unable to face the shame of losing in court to the daughter he'd disowned. Maddie felt a pang at that. Not of loss exactly, but of sadness for what might have been if her father had been capable of love instead of control. But she didn't dwell on it. She had too much good in her life to waste time mourning what she'd never had. One evening in early spring, Maddie stood in the doorway of the cabin watching Rhett in the yard. He was teaching Hope to walk. Well, trying to. At 6 months old, she was too young for actual walking, but she loved standing on her chubby legs while Rhett held her hands, bouncing and squealing with delight. Look at you, Rhett laughed as Hope bounced particularly enthusiastically. Going to be running before we know it. Maddie smiled, one hand resting on her belly, where new life had just begun to make itself known. She hadn't told Rhett yet, wanted to wait until she was certain, until the pregnancy had progressed past those dangerous early weeks. But watching him with Hope, seeing the pure joy on his face, she knew he'd be thrilled. This child would be different from Hope in one crucial way. It would be theirs from the beginning, conceived in love rather than desperation. But Maddie knew with absolute certainty that Rhett would never treat the children differently. Hope was his daughter in every way that mattered, and she always would be. What are you thinking about? Rhett called out, having noticed her watching. Just how far we've come, Maddie called back. From that fence line to this. Rhett scooped up Hope and walked over, the baby babbling happily in his arms. Any regrets? Maddie looked at this man who'd saved her when she thought she was beyond saving, at the daughter who'd given her purpose, at the home they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. Not a single one, she said. That Sunday, Maddie stood barefoot in the wildflower meadow behind the cabin, the spring sun warm on her face. Rhett had planted new flowers there, a riot of color that would bloom all summer long. Hope sat in the grass nearby, examining a dandelion with intense concentration, while Reverend Morrison smiled at them both. I thought we might renew your vows, the Reverend had suggested when he'd ridden out for his monthly visit. Make it official in a way that first ceremony wasn't. Take your time, say what's in your hearts. So here they stood, Maddie in a new dress that Rhett had bought her in town, soft blue cotton that fit her curves without apology, and Rhett in his Sunday best, looking nervous despite having done this before. I'm not good with words, Rhett began, taking Maddie's hands in his, but I need you to know that the day your father brought you to my fence line was the best day of my life. I just didn't know it yet. Maddie felt tears sting her eyes. You were so scared, Rhett continued, but so brave. And every day since, you've gotten braver. You've turned this house into a home, turned me into a husband and a father, turned yourself into the strongest woman I know. His voice roughened. I love you, Maddie called her. Not because I had to, not because it was practical, but because you're you. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that again. It was Maddie's turn, and she had to take a moment to compose herself before she could speak. When I came here, I thought my life was over, she said. I thought I was being punished, thrown away, relegated to some kind of prison. But you showed me that being wanted isn't about being perfect. It's about being real and honest and willing to fight for what matters. She squeezed his hands. You taught me that I'm not too much or too big or too broken. I'm exactly enough. And I love you for that, for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Reverend Morrison blessed them both, pronounced them husband and wife, again, and Rhett kissed Maddie slow and sweet while Hope clapped her hands and laughed at her parents. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Maddie stood on the porch with Hope in her arms and watched Rhett tend to the horses. She thought about the girl she'd been, desperate, ashamed, convinced she was worthless. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who'd fought for her family and won, who'd been thrown away and turned it into the greatest gift of her life. Behind her, the cabin was warm with lamplight. In her arms, Hope dozed peacefully. And walking toward her with that slight smile that still made her heart skip was the man who'd taken her in when she had nothing and loved her until she had everything. You coming to bed? Rhett asked, climbing the porch steps and pressing a kiss to her temple. Then to Hope's downy head. In a minute, Maddie said. I'm just taking it all in. Rhett's arm came around her waist, and they stood together watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Maddie's father was nursing his bitterness and pride. Somewhere, Thomas Fletcher was living his shallow life with his railroad heiress. Somewhere, people were still whispering about the fat girl who'd trapped herself a husband. Let them whisper. Let them judge. It didn't matter anymore. Because here, in this wild country under these endless skies, Maddie had found what she'd been searching for her whole life without even knowing it. She'd found home. Not in a place, but in a person. In a family. In the fierce, protective love of a giant with gentle hands and a wounded heart that had learned to beat again. And as Hope stirred in her arms and Rhett pulled them both closer, Maddie smiled into the gathering darkness and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The wildflowers would bloom again come summer. The seasons would turn, bringing their challenges and changes. But whatever came, they would face it together. The woman who'd been thrown away, the man who'd caught her, and the child who'd saved them both. A family built from all the things the world had tried to discard, stronger for having been tested, and loved beyond measure. And that, Maddie thought as she finally let Rhett lead her inside to their warm bed and their waiting life, was the truest kind of happy ending there was.